The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with the News Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that help to shape it. Hope you're well today. We had a small football match here in the UK yesterday. Sad to say the result wasn't the one that I wanted, but congratulations to Italy on being European champions. Fair to say I think they were probably the best team in the tournament, so I don't think we can grumble too much, although it's quite cruel to lose on penalties in the way that we did. But also huge congrats to the England team and to Gareth Southgate. Southgate got the English players playing as a team, which was fantastic, and he seems to be a very positive and nice guy. And I think it's generally quite a positive story for England. The team is very young, they'll learn huge amounts from this and hopefully come back stronger in the future. I myself have some very exciting news. I'm bringing two new additions to the team here at Canverse, which is my cannabis consultancy. Firstly, Sean Marotri. Sean is a commercial operator with deep experience working with family offices, cannabis companies and corporates. He founded and runs the Can Amplify group of companies, which are helping US and Canadian CBD brands manage, operate and grow their European operations. And secondly, Peter Potier. Peter is an experienced senior exec working with pharma and FMCG companies. He was previously EU Head of Business Development and Strategy at Pfizer, as well as having other senior roles in places like PepsiCo. And most recently, Peter was Managing Director at Materia UK, working with Deepak and Nick, who were on the show recently. I'm really very excited to bring these guys on board. They're very high quality additions to the team. They have hands-on experience of setting up and growing companies in this space, and collectively we've got a great understanding of the evolving regulatory landscape, how to navigate it and where to take advantage, coupled with a brilliant network of experts in the UK, Europe and North America. We're currently talking to various North American cannabis companies about their European strategy, as well as working with a number of startup and scale-ups looking to raise investment. So if you need help with strategy, market entry or growth for your cannabis businesses, please do reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn in the usual places, but my email address is anuj, ANUJ, at canverse, CANVERSE.global. In the meantime, on this week's show, we're talking about Cannabinoid Hyperemesis syndrome. Enjoy. On today's show, I'm very pleased to welcome back Dr. Ethan Russo. Ethan is deeply involved in medical cannabis and botanical therapeutics as a physician and researcher, very widely respected as one of the world's real thought leaders in the space. He has many roles in the cannabis industry and previously worked with GW Pharma, as well as starting his new company, Credo Science. Ethan, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Good to be back.
No, always a pleasure to have you back on. Where in the world are you today?
I'm at home, Vashon Island, Washington.
Very nice, very nice. Cool. Well, everyone knows who you are, but for the two people that don't, would you mind giving us a little bit of a background on you?
Sure. Well, I'm a neurologist by training, but I've worked on medicinal plants for 30 years now, 25 on cannabis specifically. I was with GW Pharmaceuticals full-time for 11 years and 5 years before that as a consultant. Since that time, I've been with some private companies, including our own Credo Science in the last year. So this has all been related to cannabis and the endocannabinoid system.
Yeah, fantastic. And, GW's obviously been in the news recently with a sale. How did you sort of see that as a kind of indicator of how things have moved on in the cannabis industry and how it's been treated?
Well, frankly, it's something I expected a long time ago. The entire time I was with GW, they were always a target of takeover. It just didn't happen until now. I think the number one indicator is that it shows the maturation or pending maturation of the industry, being taken seriously, etc. Now, as to the direction of the company from here, I can only conjecture. But it may be towards single compounds or even semi-synthetic compounds, which is usually the want of pharmaceutical companies. We contrast, are going in exactly the opposite direction. I'm very botanically focused, trying to leverage the synergy of different ingredients in plant-based medicines.
Yeah, we've talked about it before on the show, haven't we? The kind of the difficulty of fitting something like cannabis with multiple compounds into the pharmaceutical model.
Well, it can fit. The problem really is one of perception. The industry doesn't realize that it can fit, that it's been done before and can be done again. So certainly our focus is in that direction. But it's not only pharmaceutical development. I have always said there are three echelons of cannabis activity: the pure herbal, the supplement industry, where there may be some level of standardization, and then the highest and most difficult threshold is for pharmaceutical development of a botanical, specifically cannabis.
It's really interesting what you said. It's been done before. What are the examples of that?
Well, Sativex is approved in 30 countries, extra USA. It's not a commonly known fact that although Sativex isn't approved in the US, it did get through the chemistry, manufacturing, and control process at the FDA. What that means is the medicine was shown to have a high degree of standardization and consistency over time. And that's a big sine qua non of getting a pharmaceutical approved. Where it fell down was that the efficacy measures weren't quite good enough. It worked in an American population where the patients weren't as sick. In the Eastern European population, where the patients were so far along near death, it just didn't work as well in treating pain associated with cancer that was opioid resistant. And that's the reason it's not approved today. But I imagine the company is making another pass at it, probably for multiple sclerosis, the same indication, where it's approved in 30 other countries. So they've proven already that a complex botanical medicine can get Food and Drug Administration approval. And certainly in the European Medicines Agency and in Canada with Health Canada, it's already passed that threshold.
Yeah, thank you for that. Cool. Well, maybe let's talk a bit about the work that you're currently doing and how are things going at Credo. I think the last time we spoke, you sort of just launched it.
Sure. Well, we're well along. It's been slow in that investment in the industry has been really tough between general skittishness compounded by the pandemic. But I've dipped into the old savings and we're managing quite well on our own devices at this point. The latest development, and one I'd be really happy to talk about today, is we have discovered the genetic basis for an unusual syndrome, what's called Cannabinoid Hyperemesis syndrome. This is one of the true unusual side effects of cannabis usage. So you may hear from people that cannabis doesn't have any side effects. That's nonsense. It's a medicine. Everything has side effects. Usually the ones associated with cannabis are quite identifiable and mild and avoidable. But this one's been a bugaboo. Although it's a relatively rare condition, it's increasingly identified. So it's becoming more common. And the reason is the availability of higher THC potency material in most areas. So this is something that people need to know about, both in the medical community as well as consumers.
Yeah, cool. We'll go and talk about that in a sec because that's the main topic of the show. Are there any other projects you're working on that you can kind of give us a bit of a high level? Obviously, it's all, pretty confidential, I'm sure.
Sure. We have a novel extraction technique for cannabis. It's solventless, and the idea is to preserve the proportions of the terpenoids and cannabinoids as found in the fresh plant. Our proof of concept is pretty much done, and it looks very successful. So we hope that this is something that will be added to the armamentarium of approaches to cannabis extraction.
Yeah, and just, it's not the main topic here, but when you talk about solventless, is the advantage of that because removing the solvent from the solution at the end is part of the issue.
Right. The most common extraction techniques for cannabis are liquid CO2 extraction. It has some drawbacks because it's expensive, big investment initially in the equipment, and the way it's usually done, it will squander a good part of the monoterpenoids, the lower molecular weight aromatic compounds that many of us believe are very important to the therapeutic properties of cannabis. But it's very clean, so there's not a problem there. Also popular is cold ethanol extraction. Ethanol can mostly be removed sometimes, but it's an additional process. And this is usually done on dried material that already may have lost a good amount of the terpenoid content. And then there are other solvents that people use that are potentially more toxic. And so if they can't be purged 100%, it is undesirable. And certainly with some of the solvents, it can't be labeled as organic. So again, there are different ways to approach this. We're trying to get a cleaner, more complete extract. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and how much do you look to sort of existing industries and methods that are used on different agricultural products, let's say, to kind of look for inspiration?
Sure, it's always important to examine what's happened with other botanicals, but cannabis is unique. The real action is in the unfertilized female flowers and specifically the trichomes. And a lot of the other material is extraneous if what you're really interested in is the cannabinoids and terpenoids, because they're all concentrated in these little tiny spheres that are held on stalks away from the rest of the plant. And there are reasons for that, and there are ways to leverage that into pure extractions.
Yeah, it's a whole new topic on its own, so I won't go too much further and probe you. But let's get on to the main subject, which is cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. I've seen an increase in the number of articles being written about it, but it's probably still not that widely known. Do you mind just sort of giving us a high level on what it is and what causes it?
Sure. Okay, so this is a condition that was identified first in Australia in 2004, but their first case went back to 1996. So they reported 9 patients. Subsequently to 2004, there have been a variety of reports, probably 105 different publications, but mostly single case reports. The biggest series was from the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota in the US with 98 patients. Overall, there are only several hundred reported cases in the literature, although from talking to emergency departments and gastroenterologists, they're seeing this more often, and they consider it established enough that they don't report it anymore. But what it is an unusual constellation of symptoms that's been quite enigmatic. It affects people solely in the context of heavy chronic use of high THC cannabis material. It has a characteristic constellation of symptoms. A person might slowly develop a prodrome in which they have nausea and vomiting and abdominal pain, and then they develop the full-blown syndrome, which is nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, coupled with a characteristic associated method of treatment that people have discovered, and that is they may spend hours a day in a hot bath or shower because that seems to alleviate the symptoms temporarily, but leads to all kinds of problems. Typically, people who have this end up either hospitalized or in emergency rooms with increasing frequency, and it's tough to treat. The usual antiemetics, drugs used to treat nausea and vomiting, don't work so well. So this would be drugs like ondansetron and granisetron, what are called serotonin type 3 antagonists. Rather, what seems to work is haloperidol, a drug usually used to treat schizophrenia, or, and this is where it gets very strange, application of capsaicin ointment on the skin. Capsaicin, of course, is the caustic element in chili peppers. Now, the relationship is hot water and the caustic heat of the capsaicin both affect a receptor called TRPV1. TRPV1 is involved not just in pain responses, but also is found in the brain, and it modulates some aspects of mood and gut activity as well as nausea. So there's a tie-in there. But previously, there have been theories about what caused this, but nobody was really sure. I mean, one thing that's clear is everybody recognizes that THC, it has been a treatment for nausea and vomiting, particularly associated with chemotherapy and cancer. But many cannabinoids are subject to what's called a biphasic dose response. To break that down, what it means is a low dose THC prevents nausea, but at a high dose, it may cause it. And so what is happening, among other things, is that you're getting a paradoxical response. Now, it also could be influenced by tolerance. When someone uses a great deal of cannabis, the CB1 receptor, where cannabis lodges in the brain, has to downregulate to keep things in balance. So it becomes resistant, and something that is usually going to reduce nausea instead will produce nausea. So that much we can intuit as being related, but what we were trying to do in the project is ascertain where there was a genetic susceptibility to this disorder, because there are a lot more people that use a lot of cannabis that don't have this problem than there are people who use a lot of cannabis that do have cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So something is clearly different about these folks. And so we postulated that it could be due to a genetic abnormality and went looking for that.
Yeah, it's good. I was going to ask you are there any linking characteristics of the people that tend to suffer from this? Is there an angle around the endocannabinoid system in relation to those people that suffer from this?
Oh, yeah, we clearly thought so. So, I mean, our candidate genes for looking at this were the genes encoding for the cannabinoid receptors. Also, TRPV1, obviously. And we're also interested in genes that metabolize THC. So those were our lead indications. And actually, we hit on 2 out of 3 with that, as we'll discuss. But at the same time, to find these patients, we had to beat the bushes, so to speak. We contacted authors of prior studies. We put this on listservs. We contacted physicians who use cannabis in their practice. And we ended up with a big pool of respondents. 585 patients responded, but we wanted to make absolutely sure that there was no question that people had cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So there were 205 out of that pool that had the full constellation of symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and the bathing behavior. They had ongoing symptoms and carried a diagnosis from a physician. So we were excluding people who weren't having the problem currently. We just wanted to be careful. And we had to compare them to something. Now, picking a placebo group or a control group in this instance had to be done properly. We couldn't just use anybody, because if someone didn't use a lot of cannabis, we couldn't be sure that they wouldn't be susceptible to this problem if they did. So what we did was find people who used high amounts of cannabis, comparable to the CHS patients, but who didn't have the diagnosis or the symptoms. So anybody who had reminiscent symptoms was excluded. So that got us down to a pool of 54 controls. So already with 205 CHS patients, this study, our survey, had more than twice the number of the prior biggest study from Mayo Clinic. And, if you like, I could tell you how we compared the two groups.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Sure. So the CHS patients were high volume users of cannabis, 91% daily or more than daily use, averaging about 4 grams a day of material, most often by smoking, most often high THC material. There was a high rate of having had a diagnosis of cannabis addiction or dependency, 15.6%, and a very, very high number it had withdrawal symptoms, over half, 56.6%. The vast majority, 88%, improved after they stopped cannabis, which is the only definitive intervention. And as we knew from prior studies, almost everyone would relapse into CHS again upon resumption of cannabis usage. In comparison, the 54 controls, their use patterns were quite similar. 70% daily or greater than daily smoking of high THC material, but only 3.7% had a diagnosis at any time of addiction or dependency, and 76% never had withdrawal symptoms. Only 11% had been told to stop for health reasons. So these were high volume users of cannabis who didn't have a problem of a similar nature or much of a problem as best we could ascertain. So then we wanted to use this pool to compare their genetic makeup. And that's where things got difficult. 99 of the CHS patients agreed to get a genetic test kit, but only 28 returned them. So somewhere along the way, people got cold feet. And there's been a lot of publicity about problems with genetic testing in the US. Some people have been nabbed because their cousin had a genetic test and then they were proved to be linked to a crime. There's the usual worry about whether you're going to lose your insurance if you have some disease that's uncovered genetically. And then the association with cannabis. To be honest, we had a lot of pushback from the cannabinoid hyperemesis community. There were people that questioned our motives, actually dissuaded other people from returning the kits. So it was a bit difficult, but we did have 28 patients that returned it, and we compared them to 12 controls. And despite all that, we identified 5 genes that were statistically significant in their differences between the CHS patients and the controls.
Wow, that's really interesting to get the kind of societal kind of backdrop to people being willing to kind of cooperate with this, and very interesting. Was that quite a surprise to you guys?
Yes and no. It's hard to explain this without sounding judgmental, but it is true to say that people with CHS are highly suspicious of the medical community. It's been documented in other studies that compliance has not been very good, either with the suggestion to stop cannabis usage, which almost nobody can who has this. Additionally, there are some characterological traits that we'll get into when we discuss the results that would go along with a high degree of suspicion, even paranoia. That's part of the diagnosis, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I imagine smoking over an eighth a day is probably going to have certain effects on you and the way that you interpret things.
Sure.
I wanted to just pick up on one of the things that you mentioned. So consumption method, smoking, was that a kind of significant factor in this? For example, have you noticed this in other consumption methods, whether they be edibles or vaping or anything like that?
Well, the vast majority were smoking or vaping, particularly vape pens, which are increasingly popular in the US. However, not a lot of people were using edibles, and it's not because edibles don't do this. It's because let's look at what is happening to these folks. If you're nauseated and vomiting, you're not going to be readily consuming brownies. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say that this relates to THC intake rather than the method of intake.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And just, before we kind of move on a bit, were there any other cannabinoids or any other part of the cannabis plant that seemed to feature in this at all? Or is it very specifically THC?
Yeah, between our work and that previously done, it's clear it's related to THC. Most of the CHS patients, they weren't avid users of cannabidiol, for example. Plus, it should be mentioned, it's hard to find material that's purely cannabidiol with no THC. So, without analyzing every sample used, we wouldn't be able to say. But the culprit here clearly seems to be THC.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So when you're doing your research, could you get a kind of handle on how common this might be? It must be a very difficult question to answer. Right?
Yeah, again, it's increasingly common, but people are reticent to discuss this with their doctors. They're reticent to get medical intervention. I think we're going to find out that it's much more prevalent than we thought. And it will be increasingly prevalent because of greater dissemination of high potency material available. Back in the olden days, there was high potency cannabis. It just wasn't as common as it is now. So that's the difference. I think this is an emerging public health issue because of the increased potency of material and the emergence and recognition of this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose more extracts that are kind of higher concentrations of THC, so you're really drilling in on that single compound.
Yeah, absolutely the case. The vape pens, they can have as much as 90% THC, and the risk is of overdosage, the development of tolerance, and this kind of problem. That's really not necessary to get high initially, but people who are using these regularly just tend to have escalating dose requirements to attain their level of high that's desired.
Yeah.
They really, for the most part, aren't medical devices because with one inhalation of this high potency material, you already have overshot what you'd need to treat your pain or other symptoms.
Yeah, I can see the danger there. You talked about some of the symptoms, but is it a question if you listen to your body and you see the symptoms and you stop, then you should be okay?
Nobody does. People don't believe that THC is the culprit. There've been all these pet theories that it's related to pesticides or neem exposure. Those don't produce the same symptoms. People that have this don't tend to stop. They engage in compulsive behavior, including their cannabis usage. And people are highly resistant to the concept that cannabis is making them sick rather than helping them in some way.
So they just push through and they kind of live with the nausea and the vomiting.
And they persist despite the fact that they're extremely ill. This is extremely disruptive to people's lives and leads to tremendous morbidity in terms of illness as well as expense. We saw 2 citations in the literature of what people spent before getting a diagnosis, and one was $26,000 US, the other was $96,000 US. And that was several years ago. I mean, typically there are months or years delay before somebody gets a diagnosis, and a lot of misdiagnoses and medical interventions and diagnostics along the way, some invasive. So part of the reason we wanted to do this was to establish a genetic test that might obviate the need for all these other interventions and see who's susceptible to this.
Yeah. So I was going to say, what is the output of the research then? Is it, obviously to further understand what's the mechanisms behind it, but what kind of solutions are you looking for in relation to it?
Right. Well, that's it. I mean, another reason to do this study was seeing what problems were underpinnings of it so that we can devise better treatments.
Yeah. Wow. That sounds quite extreme, doesn't it? And it's great to really understand it here. So thank you, Ethan, for sharing that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at all that we've missed?
Yeah, very quickly, if I could, I'd like to mention the specific genes involved.
Yeah, please.
One of our hypotheses was that the CB1 receptor would be involved, but we didn't see that in our population. But that's helpful, though, because there's a condition that's often mistaken for this called cyclic vomiting syndrome, which is what's called a forme fruste. It's like a migraine without the headache, but certainly with the nausea and vomiting. That has been associated with mutations in CNR1, the gene that codes for the CB1 receptor. Where we did see statistically significant differences were in COMT, gene that breaks down dopamine in the brain. So it could lead to dopamine excess, which promotes nausea. And dopamine excess is also associated, this gene that we saw the mutations in is associated with depression, rumination behavior, and increased alcohol intake. Also some other disorders, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and psychosis. So, that doesn't mean that the people that have this genetic change have all those problems, but they're more subject to having those problems. We also saw a genetic mutation in TRPV1, the receptor I mentioned earlier. Since TRPV1 is involved in gut movement and also nausea, and the treatment, the hot water or the capsaicin treatment, this made a lot of sense. And the mutation that we saw is not previously reported in the databases that we examined. So something a little bit new here. When I say that these are statistically significant, it meant that the probability in each instance compared to the controls was less than 1 chance in 20. In other words, highly unlikely that this was spurious. It seems to be a real finding. There was also a genetic mutation in a gene called CYP2C9. That's one of the enzymes that breaks down THC in the liver or elsewhere. And so this could help explain why these people react differently to THC and could flip it from being antiemetic, reducing nausea and vomiting, to being pro-emetic. And then there was a second gene that was related to dopamine. This is a gene called DRD2. This is a dopamine receptor type 2 gene. That's the target of most antipsychotic drugs. And anything that would stimulate that is going to increase the tendency towards vomiting. This mutation has been noted before in people who are depressed or anxious. So when we've got a problem with the receptor gene and a problem with the breakdown gene, you've got a double whammy, so to speak, affecting dopamine, and it really helps explain a lot of the phenomenology attached to CHS, because they're not only having abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, and this odd behavior, but these folks have a high rate of addiction, other compulsive behavior traits, and are very subject to anxiety and depression. And then there was a fifth one. This one's a mouthful, the ABCA1, the ATP binding cassette transporter. This has to do with cholesterol metabolism, also lipid metabolism in the brain. And the hooker here is that folks that have this have been at risk for coronary artery disease, heart attacks, and type 2 diabetes, and also Alzheimer's disease. So although we don't have epidemiological evidence of this yet, it could be that folks that have CHS are going to be at greater risk of developing these problems later in life. So that's really serious.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot there.
Yeah, more than we expected, actually.
Yeah, but I guess it's so interwoven, right? Because what I understand is that they're genetically more susceptible to a lot of these things, and some of those things may in part be kind of compounding the issue in the first place, particularly around the areas of addiction and depression and anxiety.
Right. We really are looking at a vicious cycle situation from which people simply seem to be unable to extricate themselves. So, it's a serious diagnosis, one that needs better recognition, and we're really hoping that this discovery will lead to people getting the test, identifying the problem, and we can then concentrate on better, more focused treatments.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the product of your research will be helping to feed into sort of addiction and rehabilitation therapies to help people in the situation.
Well, sure. I mean, the obvious thing is to stop exposure to the offending agent, but it is more complicated than that. And these are folks that have some inherent susceptibilities to other problems, and those need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, and I guess it maybe goes to the wider issue of this kind of unending kind of want for higher and higher THC. Maybe this is a kind of a sound of caution for that.
Well, some of us have been issuing such cautions before, but there's all the more reason to do it now. I'd emphasize this is still a relatively uncommon condition, but one becoming increasingly common. We know what the trigger is. and how it can be avoided or mitigated to some degree. We need to do a better job there. There's plenty to cannabis beyond THC, and it should not be the goal to get to 100% THC. That's highly undesirable from a medical standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ethan, thank you for today. Really very interesting. And I'll be releasing this after you've released your paper, so I'll be sure to share that when I do.
Yeah, if I could just add, our work has been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. And when it's out, it will be open source. This means that anyone can have access without having to pay. We would like to get that information out there.
Yeah, happy to share that. And I'm sure it's a very valuable piece of work. So thank you, Ethan, again for joining me. Always a pleasure. And we'd love to have you back on to talk about your next piece of research.
Well, I'd be happy to do it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Pleasure. Thank you.